Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you're enjoying the content, please drop us up, drop a like, and let us know your thoughts below in the comments. Also, please consider supporting our podcast via the link below. It really helps us out. Daniel, welcome to the World XP podcast. We've been playing some phone tag for some time. Obviously, it's a bit difficult given the time difference, but happy that you could finally make it on. How are you?
Yeah, all good, thank you, and thanks for your patience and being able to get it all sorted and us chatting. So yeah, great to be on, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with if you want to introduce yourself so the people listening kind of can get a feel for who you are and what you do. And then we can jump into the question from the previous guest and then see where the conversation takes us.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'm a sports and entertainment lawyer at a law firm called Sheridans in London, and I primarily work in the football industry, working with players and agents, and I work with high net worths who buy and sell football clubs as well. My sort of side hustle, if there's one of a few, is I really enjoy writing, and I've written 2 books, one on the football industry and another book called Build the Invisible on sort of career and developmental points around how to, effectively find your dream career. And that's always been a really nice sort of thing I've done on the side, along with podcasts I do. I have a sort of fashion brand as well, and that's about it.
That's so much. I don't know. All right, let's go with the question, and then we'll jump into it because that's so much that you've just said that I'm so curious about how you have time to do all of those things. But so the question is, his name is Giuseppe. He's I'll say like political, maybe correspondent's not the right word, but he ran for office here in the States, and he's kind of working to become a campaign manager and work in that sort of industry. And his question was, what is an example in your life where you've made a complete 180 on a significant topic and changed your mind? So something where you've been presented with new information and you felt one way before, and then you totally change after that new information or whatever event it was that would have caused that change.
Well, it depends whether you want to say professionally or personally. I'll probably give one of each, actually, if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah, for sure.
I think the personal one is, I grew up, like I think maybe a lot of men do, thinking that you're your own island, that you need to take care of yourself. You don't need to burden other people with stuff. And sharing is not necessarily the greatest thing because it shows vulnerability, and your ability to communicate is really to demonstrate that everything is fine, that it's under control. And sometimes it's not fine and it's not under control. And you struggle with particular things. And so my 180 was very much the realization that I wasn't an island, that it was really important to communicate better with the ones around me, the ones that love me the most, and actually through sharing and feeling a little bit more I guess open to discussing things that maybe aren't that comfortable sometimes, actually has led to much more fulfilling relationships. So that's what I'd probably say on the personal side. On the professional side, I'd probably say it was quite a strong realization when I thought, actually, for me personally, I was probably going to work with more soccer and football clubs. That was my idea, really. I thought that's where the money was, to a degree, with all the broadcasting and sponsorship monies. And then what happened is they started recruiting in-house lawyers to do the job that I could do externally. And at that point, I was thinking, oh, well, who am I going to get as my sort of core client base? And that's when I sort of realized that would probably be on the talent side, on the player and the agent side. And so that was quite a 180 change, where a lot of my model was going to be club focused and actually became player focused.
That's super interesting, because do you know who Ben Foster is? I would assume.
I do.
So he's done several podcasts where he's gone into either some of his previous contracts with West Brom, or he's had Richard Lee on, like the goalkeeping agent. You know who he is as well, I would guess. And some of the stuff behind the scenes has become super interesting for how things work, because I have friends who will ask me often, like, why didn't such and such player move to such and such club? And I'm like, well, it could be a gazillion reasons, right? His family didn't want to move, like all the things that go on behind the scenes. And then, so to kind of set that part. And then the other part is when I look at some of the numbers that get thrown around for contracts or bonuses or some of these other things. Like I saw a headline in this transfer window that said talks broke down because there was like a bonus structure that couldn't get agreed upon, and I was like, how far away? Like when you're talking in that amount of money, and it's like, okay, he wants 65 million or he wants 75 million for the transfer. The club wants that much for the transfer fee. Like, how much is that 5 mil really? Like, how tense are those negotiations between every single penny um, in that? So I guess to kind of start with that, and I saw a picture of you with Declan Rice, I believe, as well. I think you helped with that transfer. So there's a lot in that, but just walk us through kind of the transfer world when you start talking about those kinds of numbers, and then all the things that maybe I'd say the hidden hiccups of a potential negotiation gone south, and kind of just walk us through that whole process and all the things that need to be considered, or the big ones anyways.
Well, there's lots. Look, I always think when a transfer actually happens, that's the culmination of probably 20 others that don't happen, is the truth. And that's why I always think that agents sometimes get a bit of a bad rep, because it's really, really, really difficult to get a deal actually to work for all of the reasons that you've actually just sort of articulated. And the reason tends to be because there are at least three parties to any deal, which is buying club, selling club, player, and then player's agent and image rights company and other potential sponsors. But I always tend to think that the thing that is usually given less airtime is the relationship between the clubs in order to get the deal done. Now, you said about transfer fee of a 5 mil or 10 mil difference or otherwise. Even in that, there are so many nuances, because a lot of the time, one of the real big questions that are asked by a selling club, for example, is, well, fine, you're bidding 60 million, for example, but how much of that is actually guaranteed money, i.e. dependent, regardless of what happens with the player or with the buying club, how much of that 60 million are we going to get? And the next question tends to be, how quickly are we going to get that amount as well? And then the second, which is obviously linked in part, is, well, how much of that 60, for example, is contingent, i.e. dependent on certain types of eventualities, like relegation, like promotion, like qualification for Champions League, like winning the league, like winning the Champions League, or other types of player bonuses or club contingent events or player contingent events. So and then, you might say, well, actually, it's going to be 3/4 that's going to be guaranteed, so 45 mil, and a quarter that's going to be contingent, 15 mil. And then the question might be, well, how easy is it to actually raise those contingent amounts? And then it might also be, is that 45 mil, which is guaranteed, how long is that going to take to be paid? Is it going to be 5 million up front, or is it going to be 30 million up front? And a lot of the time, then, if it's going to be more up front, the selling club might be willing to take a discount on the overall figure in order to get more money quicker, than that they can reinvest into the squad, into wage increases, into pay upgrades, etc. And that, in effect, is just some of the issues that can impact on the bilateral agreement between the two clubs. That doesn't really take into account, obviously, then the negotiation that has to happen between the buying club and the player on, salary, image rights, bonuses, release clauses, squad bonuses, and everything else that comes with it.
So I want to jump backwards. I'm going to tie what you just said into it in a second. But when you're growing up and you're like, hey, I want to be involved in football, and maybe agent, like coach, like all of these different areas and potential jobs that are related allow people who are fans or who really love the sport to still be involved. What was it for you that you were like, yes, I really want to be involved in all of these potential things that could go wrong and could potentially be very stressful? Let's do that. Like, how did you get to where you are, and how was the career process for you to get to this point? Because it's not easy to break into the football space, as I'm sure you know, especially in with the dollar or the monetary figures that are at stake. people tend to go with people that they know and trust, and to get your break in the industry seems like it would be quite difficult. So how did you get to where you are negotiating like the Declan Rice contract, or like being a part of that transfer?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, you know, the story is, for growing up, I'm still am a Liverpool fan. I loved football, loved reading it, loved watching it, loved listening to, family conversations around the dinner table. Born in Liverpool, lived there until I went to university in Manchester, and even then came back for most home games and went away to some of the away games too. I was privileged to go to lots of great football matches over the years, is the truth. So, you know, it was really a little bit of an obsession, really, in truth, an addictive obsession where, everybody tries to find that link between their passion and their day job. The downside is that it becomes a bit all encompassing, so that, everything mixes in together. The upside is, like you've said, with all the things that, because, over so long a period of time now, I'm sort of so consumed inside the industry, it becomes, you still have to know what you're doing. But it just becomes one and the same, really, in terms of your identity. And that's usually okay, but sometimes can, have its downsides. But I think, and for the best part of 10 years, I was a lawyer, not really doing a huge amount of football work. I was, I would say, honing and perfecting my art as trying to become the best lawyer I could, in truth, if that's a regulations lawyer, if it's a contractual lawyer, if it's an intellectual property lawyer, if it's an employment lawyer, if it's a disputes lawyer, if it's a, disciplinary lawyer. And all of those facets then obviously become very, very helpful and handy inside of the football industry. So in the end, there's no point me being a great football industry analyst or understanding the game if I don't understand the law, because that will just get you nowhere. In the same way as that you can be a great lawyer but not understand the industry, and that'll obviously be a tricky one as well. So it's at that midway point between having this side hustle of wanting to work in sports and football and really trying to understand everything that's going on in the industry, and then the skill set matching up with it at the right time. And it started on topics like third-party ownership, so Javier Mascherano and Carlos Tevez matters. It then sort of went on to FFP and cost control. It then sort of siloed into a few other areas around the agents regulations and working with agents more generally, and then moved into sort of transfers and image rights and commercial deals and boot deals and everything else that stemmed from there. So it's really been a slow burn, to put it mildly. I'm almost 20 years in the industry now, but for the first 7-8 years or so, I was in all types of sectors, be it agriculture, farming, auto parts, aviation, financial services. You wouldn't be having me on your podcast if I was having to talk about those type of things, but it's that intersection where it becomes interesting because, you're helping with some big moves.
Yeah, that makes sense. So was law an interest for you growing up as well? And then once you got into law, you figured out, oh, there's a way that I can make my football interest in my skill set in law work? Or was law a means to the end of getting into the football industry?
I think at the beginning it was a means to an end, because my dad is and was a lawyer. My uncle was. I've got loads of family members that are as well. Law was basically just the default into, I'm not really sure what I want to do, but that might be quite a useful starting position.
Mm-hmm.
And as sort of my law journey progressed from university, I just lapped up any cases that related to football and or sports. It's like anything that was cycling, judo, karate, Olympics, cricket, tennis, got whatever it was. And they tended to be around European law matters, free movement of people and workers. That's what it tends to be. So my move into sport was actually a move into EU law. And that's how I started out as a lawyer, which was an EU competition lawyer that specialized in various elements of different sectors. But it was EU law regulation, in truth. But that held me in really good stead, because my analogy is, if I could read 300 pages of agriculture regulations, I could definitely read 500 pages of the FIFA regulations. And that specialty of being able to understand difficult rules and regulations held me in really good stead to then allow myself to really dig deep into all of the football rules. And there are tons of them, from FIFA, UEFA, Premier League, FA, EFL, and then different types of regs, and they were always changing. And then there were new sets like FFP or otherwise. So it was like a gold mine, really, in truth, of me wanting to understand the industry and then using my skill set accordingly.
That makes all the sense in the world. It's really interesting, that transition, because you've got this goal in mind, and at some point where in your head were you thinking something along the lines of, if I read another packet of these new regulations from some football governing body somewhere, I'm going to stop, because this is getting ridiculous. Like when you mentioned that it's a slow burn. So were you seeing little, like, the light at the end of the tunnel? For example, every year or so you'd get a new case or a new situation that would take you closer to the end goal. And then to go on top of that, when you mentioned before that you were looking to be more club centric, what made you, instead of saying, okay, maybe I'll try and become one of the in-house lawyers for one of these clubs, to say, no, actually, I'm going to pivot and I'm going to work with the players instead? How was that process for you, and how did that sort of all shake itself out?
Yeah, on the first thing, no, I mean, it was not only a slow burn, but there was no reward. I just couldn't see any light at the end of the tunnel for ages and ages and ages. And
So what kept you going then, is kind of
well,
what I was getting at.
well, what kept me going actually was I was just blogging. There weren't too many other lawyers out there um, that were blogging about complex areas of the law as they related to football, and that's what sort of kept me going to a degree, to the extent that I knew that if I could articulate difficult concepts accessibly, it was just going to help me in lots of different directions, and it did in so many ways. So when certain blogs got a lot of traction online or otherwise, you go onto Sky or you go onto BBC or ITV or all of these news channels, which obviously creates a positive level of status in truth, and that reflected status starts at least planting the seed in people inside and outside the industry that he must know what he's talking about. And at that point, I wasn't doing a huge amount of sports work, but it was increasing in little things. So you'd have the odd thing that was going on, or even at my firm that wasn't necessarily a big sports practice. Every now and then you'd get a sports or a football matter, and I would just jump on all of those particular things. So at that first thing, it was I just wanted to build up my bank of knowledge through demonstrating my expertise. And my expertise early on was writing, in the end, over 350, 400 blogs on the football industry from a legal perspective. So that's how it sort of that's where it stemmed. That's where there was sort of quite strong knowledge foundations came from, I would hope. And then on the pivoting, I would simply say it was a combination of everything. Some conscious and probably a lot unconscious, which was the more opportunities I thought there were to be able to work with clubs, and the more clubs that said thanks, but actually we've got our own lawyers, or we're actually recruiting, would you be interested? And that was never what I wanted to do anyway. It got me thinking, and then I with networking and relationship building, you start getting closer to a few agents. You're out having chats with them about particular things. You're trying to add a bit of value. You're not necessarily billing them huge amounts, if anything at all, at the beginning, because you need to build that relationship. And then when a transfer happens, when a contract needs to be negotiated, when something goes wrong or there's a problem and they phone you up, and then you manage to deal with the problem well, and in a positive way, you make them look good, which obviously reflects well on them for their players, or vice versa. The truth is, it's just in the power of doing. Then, as you can imagine, what happens is the agent comes back because you've done a good job, and he or she expects you to do a good job the next time, which then you have to do. And then you start building the practice, which is then you do higher profile deals, and then you're used to dealing with all these types of issues. You're used to understanding the dynamics of particular people and personalities at certain clubs. You can then do things at the same time of, playing situations and trying to play them well. And then the positive thing that happens is, players talk in the dressing room as well. Oh, Daniel helped me with this. I'm not saying it happened all the time, but when they're saying about, well, who did you help, or what's your agent like, or who's your lawyer, or whatever, it did happen. So then people or players will WhatsApp me or get in touch or through their agents and say, we need a bit of help with this. I saw that you did this deal or whatever it was. So, as you can probably see, I'm generalizing massively, but a real slow until you can demonstrate that competency. And then when you can demonstrate that competency at scale, things then moved quite quickly. It's almost like you had to do about 98% of the work with no results at all. And then that final 2%, when actually a lot of it comes off, is actually not the most valuable, but the most important.
Yeah, because once you get the first one in, you've done a good job, then the ball kind of starts to roll itself. You mentioned my next question was going to be, and you kind of touched on it already, some of the different personalities and the key players in the different clubs or around the leagues. And I was curious, every time I talk with somebody who deals with, I'll say, high net worth individuals, it's always interesting to me to see how the first interaction between that person, you or whoever, and those individuals are, and how quickly you can figure out how to play the different or not play, but figure out the different personalities and how to make sure that everyone stays kind of happy, right? Because these people, not that they're not bad people by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a different, almost like species of person, if that makes, like they deal with things differently than also regular people. Was that a big kind of shift for you to do? Like you go in the room and you've got for example, like the Glazers or whatever, like one of these big people that own all these Manchester United or the Fenway Group with Liverpool and all these personalities. Was that a big kind of culture shock for you, or was it more you went in and kind of were a fly on the wall and you were able to absorb, or like how did that work? Because you've got, right, with the Declan Rice transfer, for example, you've got the Kroenkes writing a check for 100 and whatever million, depending on the currency that you're using. That's obviously a lot of money for anyone. So what is on the line for these people is often more than just that deal. It's if that transfer doesn't go through, then maybe they don't do as well and they don't get into the Champions League next year. So the funding from the TV rights is not as much, and it's all these cascading things. So it seems like there's a lot riding on all of these different things. And then you are the guy that you can make zero mistakes in terms of the writing and the language that's in all these written documents. Because if there's a loophole that somebody else is able to exploit, and then you're the one in trouble. So how were you able to kind of cope with that and deal with that? And was that a big stress for you at first? Or how did you how did you handle that?
Well, I think dealing with different personalities is probably the most important element. In truth, how do you start and maintain and develop relationships? All I would say is when you're dealing with high profile people, owners, directors, chief executives, directors of football, chief negotiators, whoever it might be, there's always a few things. When you're trying to get them to be your client, what they will tend to be doing is trying you out, is the truth, and testing you out, which is they're asking difficult probing questions and trying to work out whether you actually know what you're talking about, is the truth, and how you can handle particular situations. So being calm and relatively straightforward and not being overly talkative, in my experience, tends to work better. When you're negotiating on the other side of very highly experienced negotiators, I actually think the same also applies in truth, depending on negotiation strategies. And we've done it all, and I've seen it done brilliantly in lots of different ways. Sometimes people will scream and shout. Sometimes people will stay silent for 2 minutes and wait for the other person or otherwise to sort of break the deadlock of particular things. A lot of the time, things are done digitally. Huge amount of times, things are done on email. Less and less is done, via face-to-face in different ways. So, and most of it is all relationship and trust built in all of those ways. So there are so many nuances to it all. And all I would say is that, oddly, I know it sounds very basic, but everybody is human and everyone's got their own stuff. And it's almost sometimes built up in the media, this negotiator for this club or this agent there or otherwise. And I've been lucky enough to be in quite a lot of the rooms and or calls where these types of things happen. And the most important thing generally is that there's experienced people that know their stuff, that know that in the end, a negotiation tends to be where most people go away mildly unhappy. And that's the sign usually of a decent negotiation, in truth. There are some clubs that I've dealt with that are pretty steadfast in their approach not to compromise at all, and others that are absolutely more pragmatic in certain ways to be able to get things over the line. And there are certain agents that know or prefer not to deal, or to deal with certain clubs because they're more generous, they're easier to get on with, or vice versa, and everybody knows how to deal with particular characters. So it's a lottery sometimes, depending on which club is the most interested in the particular player at a certain time.
Yeah. My next question, if you feel like you cannot give enough information to give a satisfactory answer, we can move on. But is there any club or group of, or have you ever dealt with a situation where somebody had a certain reputation and you were completely surprised that they were not that? Like, for example, so the example that comes to mind in my head is Daniel Levy's known as a kind of a tough negotiator. Has there anyone that you've dealt with who's been in that sort of ilk of, and you don't have to say, well, has there anyone that's been like surprised you that they haven't been the way that they've been portrayed in the media, or kind of what their persona seems?
Yeah, I haven't dealt with Daniel personally, so I don't know offhand is the
Mm-hmm.
truth. But all I would say is that when you get to that level of executive standing at any of the larger clubs, you have to be excellent at what you do, in truth. Otherwise, you fall away. My view is you fall away pretty quickly because something won't be done satisfactorily enough, in truth, because your owners, the chief executives, or otherwise will hold you accountable to it in different ways. So whenever I know that I'm working and negotiating with my clients, whoever that might be, with all of the top clubs, I know generally we'll get to a solution on stuff. There might be some terse moments throughout, which is absolutely fine. And I don't know whether they will say, oh, I'm having to deal with Daniel again, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe both is the truth, but that's fine as well. But I think if you ask people in industry generally, they would always prefer to know that the people they tend to come across more often are the ones that are doing the deals, that understand the nuances of stuff, that know how to find solutions, because that's what it's all to do with, really, in the end, is the truth, and to compromise where necessary, but also to foretell, to forward think about the stuff that might impact on a deal happening or not, because a deal happening is still the outlier, is the view. And in my view, like, a lot of the time, to get so close where you're getting lawyers and negotiating all the rest of it, you're pretty much there, is the truth. But as you said in the beginning, fall away quite quickly when the finances don't work for the various parties involved.
That makes sense. I got one more kind of negotiating deal question, and then I want to move on to your books and some of the writing and some of the other stuff that you do. I don't really like to ask super basic questions like this. I try to keep it more informal rather than very like interviewee, but this is going to be kind of an interviewee question. Did you ever have a situation where you learned the hard way, right? You missed something in a contract somewhere or something like that, and you found out the hard way that you missed it?
Look, there are always things that come up in every deal that you're thinking, could I have said something there, or could we have pushed harder there, or could we have done something different to find a better solution? That's the sign of self-reflection, is the truth. And I know agents will think the same, and I know clubs will think the same, and everyone will have that position. My role a lot of the time is almost like, I always find it sometimes, a risk manager. So there will always be things that I can keep on negotiating on because I think the risk is too high, because I am a risk-averse lawyer that will try and minimize risk for an agent and or a player generally. But I'm very pragmatic. I'm pragmatic enough to know that an agent might be willing to take a view on a particular legal clause or a particular consequence or whatever else it might be, specifically because they're willing to take the higher risk than I potentially am or want to advise them. And that's absolutely fine, because my role then as a result is to say, look, that's fine. If you are happy with that risk, at least I explain it to them, and then they can go ahead and do. Now, are there instances when the agent or player take the risk and then something happens as a result later down the line? It absolutely can do. But everybody knows the rules of the game and the risk that is necessarily associated with it. But that is in the very, very, very significant minority of situations. So, but that's my role. My role is always the pessimist. What if this happens? What if this goes wrong? How do we deal with this particular situation? How do we flesh out and this and that? So long as my clients are aware of the risk, I can push as hard or as little in particular situations. And like anything, it's always pretty time sensitive, and there's usually deadlines involved, and there's usually non-legal time pressures. So that's what I'm faced with on a day-to-day basis when I'm negotiating deals. And ultimately, I'm only one small cog in the wider sporting mechanism.
Yeah. You brought up one thing. Okay, one more question, then your books. On deadline day, is your phone going crazy, or is that more of an agent's? Because I remember Ben had Richard on right after the deadline, the transfer deadline, and he was like, yeah, for that like week leading up to deadline day, everything is going bananas, and then it kind of settles down after that. Are you in a similar sort of situation?
Usually, most of my clients get most of their deals done way in advance. So historically, I know it sounds a really boring answer, I'm not too manic on deadline day. Traditionally,
Well,
that's
good.
been, yeah, the last 2 deadline days I have been, and that's just particular scenarios and situations that have occurred where it's been very busy and difficult to juggle so many particular things. But that's why, I'm lucky enough to have a great team, and then, we split things up and we make sure, there's more than just 2 or 3 people across particular deals at any one time. So it absolutely can be. And the other thing is you're dealing with huge amounts of money with, sometimes limited review of documentation. And that's obviously everyone's risk to take. But, ideally, having a little bit more time to be able to review from a lawyer's perspective is always key. You don't always get it.
Yeah. Okay, so you've written, you said 3 books?
So, yeah, I mean, if you call the journal a book, which I think I'll hopefully do, then yes. Yeah. So three-ish books.
Okay, so the one that caught my sort of eye, and the one in the football industry for sure, but the one that you wrote, I think this is the journal one, where kind of how to find a career that you love. Where was that a reflection of your own journey? And if so, where did that idea come from to kind of write that down? And then what sort of things have you found in the book? Like if you were to give away some bullet points and then tell everyone to go read the rest of it. But what are some of the things that you found when writing and doing the research and that for that?
Yeah, so I wrote the book Build the Invisible, which is sort of practical ideas to achieve your dream career. That's the sort of subtitle. And for Build the Invisible, the idea was to not give the same short answer to people that keep asking me the same question. So over a long period of time, because I'm working in the football and sports industry, it's a big passion industry. People are really invested and want to combine their job with the thing that they love. And since I even just started blogging and was being involved in the industry 15, 20 years ago, people were saying, oh, how can you get into the football industry? What do I need to do? And the problem was I was giving relatively not bad answers, but just incomplete answers, really, because I think really at the heart of it, everyone just wanted to know what the secret was. What's the secret? And then I can go away and do the thing. And the truth is that there absolutely is no secret whatsoever. And the answer is incredibly mundane and boring, but not a lot of people want to hear the long slog argument, the long slog perspective, which is, and the takeaway from the book, and we can go into it a few more areas, is knowledge acquisition plus starting off and doing, mixed with developing long-term relationships, added in a section on dealing with failures and how to pick yourself back up and keep going, over a long period of time, compounding, is much more likely to get you to the position that you want to get to. So if you work backwards from all of those elements, and none of this is rocket science, is the truth, but in the end became a very useful sort of roadmap. So what I did for Build the Invisible, as well as tell some of my own stories and some of the challenges, was I spoke with around 50 industry friends and clients from across music, TV, film, entertainment, sports, football, esports, etc., and asked them about their journeys in. And the few of the interesting threads or sort of consistent narratives throughout were, number one, this idea of what I think I call proactive patience. So I think patience generally is always in short supply, regardless of the generation. I was definitely very impatient when I was young to try and work in sport and football, and it wasn't.
Yeah.
Sorry, Eric. And it wasn't happening. But what I was doing at the same time was trying to put my best foot forward in writing my blogs, for example, going to conferences, trying to meet people, trying to give compliments, trying to understand how they've done the things that they've wanted to do. And that whole knowledge section is quite an important bit, I think, really, because what effectively I've realized is, you've got to be able to start somewhere and build that understanding of the industry you want to go into. You can't really just superficially say, oh, I love tennis or football or basketball because I love watching it. You've got to love it, because in the end you've got to understand really where the money comes in and out, and what the industry is based on, and then how you might find your part in that industry, in truth. So the overarching beginning of the book is actually to be like, right, you need to know enough about the industry so that then when you're starting to have conversations and build relationships and show worth and show interest, you can start to say interesting things and develop your voice. And once you can do that, and scale those relationships and knowledge over not necessarily just a month or 3 months or 6 months or a year, but a decade. I know that it's difficult to almost say decade, because you've got to do a week's worth first, and then you've got to do a month's worth next, and then you've got to do another month. And it's all of these human stuff around falling off the wagon and not doing anything for a month, and then feeling rubbish with yourself and being like, well, what do I do next? Do I pack it all in? Do I tell myself the story that I always tell myself, which is I'm no good and I'm just an imposter and it's never going to happen for me? Or do I get back going and do this thing again? And so the last chapter of my book, Build the Invisible, is all to do with the F word, failure, more or less. I call it the F word chapter. And I mentioned quite a lot of different books throughout, but the main book that really had a real impact on me was Mindset by a lady called Carol Dweck. And Carol talks a lot about growth mindset and the idea about the power of yet. She does a really great, powerful TED talk about the power of yet. And it's about how,
I think I've heard it.
It's great. And it's all just about, how teachers mark kids' exam papers, not with a fail, but with a not yet. And that, obviously nuanced perspective to a fail, which feels very definitive, and a not yet, which feels very fluid, and you can improve and you will get there in the end, feels a lot more optimistic. And so it's just all of these, I thought, quite nice concepts, trying to weave a lot of these things together. And to go back to your first question of why did I write it? I wrote it because I wanted to sort of demonstrate that when people say, oh, I was just lucky, I think what they actually mean is, but they don't really want to say it either because it sounds too self-effacing or something, is I put a real forensic process in place over a 5 or 10 year period to get closer to the outcome that I wanted to get to. And these are some of the things that I actually did. And that to me feels a lot more empowering than people just saying, oh, I was in the right place in the right time for the thing to happen, which to me feels very passive and feels very quite pessimistic. Like if I'm not in the right place at the right time, it's not happening and it's not my fault and I can't do anything about it. Whereas I'm very much the optimist of put yourself in the best position for the best outcome to occur. And you do that by creating tons of these opportunity windows. And then all that basically has to happen, I know it sounds again very basic, is you just need one of those opportunities to come off. So how best do you put yourself in these opportunity windows to be able to say interesting things based on a long time of compounding your knowledge and relationships so that you can get closer to what you want to do?
Yeah, I fully agree. A lot of the people I've talked to on here who have been entrepreneurs or have had some level of success in their field have all said basically the same thing, in which it's a lot of work, it's a lot of grinding to get your knowledge base up, and then it's making sure that you put yourself in the position to meet the right people, and when you do meet them, that you are able to take advantage of that opportunity. Um, and it's so interesting that you mentioned people saying, I got lucky or I was in the right place at the right time. And I think what you said about people not wanting to seem too like self-aggrandizing or whatever the term is, I think that's very accurate. But I also think that those people are like that because they're still working hard. And if that makes sense, like they are that way because, and they give you that answer because they think that they haven't made it yet, or they think, and they're still working. And I think that is kind of the marker of, if you hear somebody say that, for those listening, if you hear somebody say that, you ask somebody who's in an industry and they tell you that they got lucky, you should try and dig a little bit deeper because oftentimes there's a real process there, like you mentioned. So I think it's good that you wrote it down, but yeah, like you said also before, then people actually have to go and do the legwork to make it happen. But the roadmap I think is super important because people will see people on social media or in these other things. They're like, they've already made it to some level of success, and it seems so unattainable for somebody that's just out of university or whatever. Um, yeah, the world is an interesting place for sure. Do you have people right out of university at Sheridans, or how, like, do you have younger people that you're guiding along?
Yeah, I mean, there's all different things that we try and do. So, for example, along with one of my clients, actually, who's Mesut Ozil's agent, who's a great agent, so good, we put on a sort of sports industry and mentoring seminar every year in London for a weekend, more or less, where we get a few hundred people together. We talk about football stuff. We talk about sort of personal development and how to go about doing the right things in the right way. And it's always a really great weekend. Um, I do mentor quite a few just people quite randomly, is the truth, either inside of Sheridans or, just chatting to people every now and then and trying to help with certain things. But the way that I found to try and do it a little bit more is things like this, to be fair, Eric, where hopefully I'm able at a tiny bit more scale to be able to say helpful things that spark people off to go and do the things that they want to do. So I gave a talk at one of my clients' EuroLeague basketball to their MBA program about, you want to get into sports. So the topic was, you want to get into sports, don't worry about sports, which again sounds quite counterintuitive, but to a lot of people, it ended up being quite a useful thing for them, which was it sort of depressurized them a bit to be like, if it doesn't happen for me now, it doesn't mean it's never going to happen. Sorry, without using too many negatives, but
No, it's good.
the idea is that I think I put too much pressure on myself when I was going into the industry to be like, I really want to be a football lawyer now. Why can't I be? Now it worked out okay in the end, thank goodness. But I think for a lot of people who maybe try and find that entry level sports job where they're competing with so many others because everybody's got the same lack of skills in truth, and then you're at, it can be a bit of a lottery. That actually going into another sector possibly working in a big marketing firm if you want to be a sports marketeer at some point. Just because you didn't make that first sports job doesn't mean that in 5 years, when you're maybe a more senior marketing executive, you can't then make the jump. Because my view a lot of the time is it's the skills that are the more important thing rather than the sector. You can still do your sector side hustle of knowing everything about the NBA or everything about, the IPL or otherwise. The difficulty is usually the day-to-day work grind, how to activate, how to work with clients, how to draft a good thing, how to be responsive, how to be on time. And then sometimes after a while, the way I try to market it to everybody was, instead of you needing the sports industry ends up needing you, because ultimately skill set is that much better a little bit further down the line. And that's the sort of depressurizing that I think is actually a very important message to get across. And sport is just the metaphor, the example. It reflects on loads of different industries, I think, is the truth. And when I sort of got that right in my head, it became quite an important message just to get across to people, which is you'll get there in the end if you're willing to put the time and effort in. But the variable is you're not quite sure whether it's going to be 6 months or 6 years is the truth. The query is whether you're going to last the course. And some people will and some people won't. But that should hopefully make you feel better in the shorter term about it.
Yeah, I fully agree, especially the thing you mentioned about, can you write? Are you responsive? Are you on time? All those things that are industry agnostic, that they translate from industry to industry. And so if you, to tie it into your seminar and mentoring of people, I guess, is that something that you kind of hit on a lot with people, with younger people? It's like, okay, maybe you don't get into sport right away, but make sure that you do these basic things because they translate to everywhere, and you will stand out regardless of the industry, especially if I've found that out kind of in my own experience going into an industry. It's like, oh, okay, well, he shows up on time and he can write and he's responsive and he can talk to people. And that's kind of like, if you can do those 4 things, and there's probably a few others that I'm forgetting, but if you can do those things, you're kind of set, for lack of a better term. And then you go into your industry and then you learn, whether it's on the side or on the job, then you learn the kind of specifics of what you need to be doing. Is that what you found when you've been mentoring kind of young people as?
But I think there's a really big thing about people thinking that if it doesn't happen now, then the things that I've learned for the interview is then a waste, or the 3 jobs before that I did in order to try and get me closer to the industry is then a waste, or the time that I had a coffee or woke up early or did whatever it was is a waste. And my strong view in all of that is, and again, it's taken me a lot of self-reflection to work it out, is, and I've definitely plagiarized it from someone cleverer than me, which is, I have this phrase, which is, nothing is a waste and everything is an opportunity. So everything that you go do before puts you into a better position to achieve the thing you want to do as a result. And every experience, usually probably the most uncomfortable experiences, are the ones that definitely hold you in better stead, is the truth. I had one chief exec that I interviewed for the book, a guy called David Lampett, who's a good friend and a lovely guy. And he said that when he is interviewing younger people, especially, he asks them about their failure roadmap. So he actually asks them and says, give me an example of when things didn't go well and how you remedied the situation. Because what he said to me was, he has difficulty when maybe these straight A students, these gold standard students, have gone the whole way through life without too much of a bump. And these bumps will always happen regardless of whether you're 6 or 60. And usually they'll probably happen somewhere in between. And what he wanted to know about a potential employee was how you're going to deal with stuff when things go wrong, because they will always happen. If it's a relationship with a client, with a work matter, with a particular deal, when something doesn't go right for you, how do you deal, and how do you build, and have you got those resilience banks, and have you been able to practice all of those resilience skills to ensure that you can cope when stuff doesn't go particularly well? And so I think all of that has held me in very good stead from my previous jobs and the previous sectors that I've worked with at different times. because that's what sort of like, without getting too philosophical, that's what life is all about. It's here to, throw you curveballs a lot of the time. But ideally, there are things that you can control and can't control. The things that you can control, you try and do your absolute best at. The things that are outside of your control, you can still have your own response. You can control your own response to that particular scenario. And so the reason, without going off on different tangents again, sorry, is like the need to mentor and to be able to, I don't feel like I'm a mentor, I'm just trying to give some practical advice sometimes to younger guys and girls. In truth, is I think most of the time people probably just need to be a bit kinder to themselves, to self-reflect a little bit more on stuff, and actually take a lot of comfort out of when things go wrong, but they still turn up for work the next day and they still want to grind it out and they still want to get better and still learn. And that's actually the thing I think that's underrated the most, the act of turning up, which is, quite a big one, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I want to touch on another thing that you mentioned earlier, and then with this last answer about being kinder to yourself, the imposter syndrome. Was that something that you experienced, and how did you deal with that? I know most of the people that listen to this are kind of around my age, mid late 20s, trying to, I don't know, I assume some of them are trying to make their way in the world. I don't know about the other ones, but is that something that you experienced, and how did you deal with that? How did you overcome it? Was there a level of self-reflection within your journey that you learned to self-reflect more? And is that kind of how you dealt with that, or what was that like for you?
Well, I think most people have this issue, whatever you want to call it, if it's imposter syndrome or otherwise. I think on the whole, it's been a relatively positive experience. And I only say it because the imposter syndrome is the thing that spurs you on to get better at doing it. Now, the negative voice of imposter syndrome says you're never going to be any good, so why bother? But if you can be on the right side of it, which is you're not good enough, the thing that you can control about that is, well, I actually need to get better. So how do I get better? So, and then you go about the knowledge grind is the truth, and getting out of your comfort zone and doing things which make you better and make you more comfortable about being able to do the thing. I think the opposite of imposter syndrome, I think a lot of the time can be complacency. I sometimes think complacency is actually worse than imposter syndrome, in truth.
I agree.
And whether complacency mixed in with overconfidence is the same side of a slightly different coin, I think is the case too. Now, the problem with imposter syndrome is it can be seen as negative fuel. So you can only survive on the I need to get better, I need to get better, I need to get better, and I will do because I'm going to keep grinding at it. I think that negative fuel only lasts for so long until you get to a place where you feel that you're actually improving a significant amount to say, actually, I think I am pretty good now. Now, that's not me being complacent. It's me now saying, I think that from a logical perspective should mean that quietens down that part of my brain. Whether it does or not is a different matter. But that's the bit that I think then adds to the kindness bit, which is you can still be kind to yourself and say, well done, you've improved on all of these areas. It doesn't mean you can't keep going, but it's the kindness bit and the positivity of that to yourself that then I think leads to a kindness and positivity towards others, because there is absolutely, in my experience, no way that you can be kind and positive and provide compliments and authenticity to others and giving them confidence if you're not telling yourself the same things. In truth, you're positive. The story that you tell yourself ultimately reflects in the story that you then tell to others, and so that imposter syndrome is quite, you got to be quite cautious about. But in my experience, sometimes it hasn't worked out great, has ended up being quite useful.
Yeah, no, I fully agree, especially with the last part about if you're not kind to yourself, and then the complacency piece. I think if you have a kind of quiet security or confidence in your own abilities with coupled with the I still need to get better and improve because I can't become complacent, and you exude that kind of into the world, then that's optimal, I would say. I don't know if you
Yep.
found that, but also do you have time to touch on your other two books before we get you out of here?
I've got about 3 or 4 minutes. Is that all right?
Sure. Why don't you give a quick summary of the books, your other books, and then I've got a few housekeeping things that I want to ask you once we get offline.
So yeah, I mean, I wrote Build the Invisible after writing Done Deal, which was the first book that I wrote that was published back in 2018, in truth. And that was a book that had stemmed from my blogging, from all of my football blogs, in truth, that I thought I would convert into a book, which obviously took a lot more time than just cutting and pasting everything, unfortunately. But it ended up being a great journey for me, a very, very hard journey, in truth, because I had my first daughter was 2. My wife was pregnant with our second one, who's now 8 years old. I just moved law firm. I was just trying to build sports practice, and I was sort of writing this in my spare time, in the weekends, more or less, and late at night, in truth. But that gave me a great springboard into, in a positive way, the status game of speaking from someone of experience in the football industry to explain how the football industry worked in lots of different ways. And that was fantastic. And sort of brought me on to a different level, in a way, where I would start getting inbound, queries and questions, and people get in touch with me, rather than, for a long time, me being out in the market, self-justifying, explaining what I could do and all the rest of it. It just became a little bit more of an even into outbound, in terms of work and things that I could demonstrate to people.
Yeah, that's makes total sense. Okay, so just to wrap up real quickly, where can people find your books? On Amazon, I'm assuming, and everywhere else?
Yeah, exactly. So Build the Invisible has been out for a few months now. Along with Build the Invisible is the journal. So we've talked about processes and the longevity of it all. The journal is more or less the how to do 3 things per day and get better incrementally over the year, and read and listen and watch to all of this and watch all of this content. So the book and the journal sort of go alongside each other. And Done Deal has been out for a good few years now, and at some point, sooner rather than later, I think I'm going to have to, which will be really good, write a sort of sequel to that at some point. But I'll have to work out when I can have a bit of time to be able to do that, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, guys. So the rest, all that stuff will be in the description, along with Daniel's website and his law firm. Daniel, thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed the conversation, and yeah, we'll get you out of here. Any last nickels?
All good. Thank you. Do I need to give a question to the next person?
Yeah, we'll do it offline. It has to be a surprise.
Okay, good.
All right. Okay, guys, for those listening at home, we'll see you guys next time. Peace.